we are going to talk about business models. The idea is just to explain quickly. I think that Thibaut already explained why it is important for biocontrol, so I might have some point about that, but I will dig deeper into the how to do that. And of course, I do support Flora's point that said that it's a multi-stakeholder partnership, but at least thinking in terms of business model can provide people with new ideas on how to integrate the huge industry that is mainly dominated by conventional companies. So the idea is, it is one aspect, but of course, lobbying, we need various forces to change the whole system. Anyway, so my agenda is pretty simple. So first of all, I will come back to what is business model. So it's at the origin, it's a term that comes from practitioners, actually, people working in companies, and it was developed by, in particular, in the e-business industry in the 2000s. And these terms came into the academic vocabulary in the 2010 in management, because there is management science. So I'm a researcher and a teacher at the university in management, and it was only in 2010 that this word came into the paraphernalia and the concepts in management, and so it took 10 years. Why did it took so many time? It was because the term business model and the concept refer to different disciplines inside management. First, it deals with strategy. It means like all the decisions that we have to take into consideration when we are in place of decision, either an entrepreneurs of a very small firm or decision makers in huge firms, CEOs and all these big people. Second, it also deals with questions related to customers, to market share, which is taken into consideration in management by marketing. And last, it also deals with question of costs and revenues, which is dealt by management control, which is another discipline in the field of management. So that's why it created some kind, like the defenders of industrial strategy were saying it's only strategy, it's the same thing, but other people were not agreeing. So it was like a 10-year dispute to eventually internalize this into our terms. So eventually, business model was defined in various ways, and it's always true. We can have several definitions. It depends on what we want to represent. So something is, you can describe an existing company and how it create and capture value. So it is part of what we try with we try to make people describe their model with the questionnaire that we sent to presenters. And it can also be recognized as the assumption made by decision makers. So I'm not very much, we won't use this definition here, but it is also an artifact to foster creativity, entrepreneurial creativity. So what we are interested in today and tomorrow is about the first and the third definition that I present you. So, as Thibaut said before, no, business models are not just about generating money. Generating money is a consequence of business choice, but it's not, you never choose to develop a business in relation to the profit margin that you intend to make. It is generally because you have an idea, you want to be innovative, you want people to adopt your technology, and there are many, many, many good reasons to do that. So I think that if some of you have been, have dealt with enterprise creation, you might have met the business model Canva, but I won't use this perspective because I think it doesn't dig deeper into the very basic components of the business model. So for talking about business modeling, I prefer to use another model that's called RCOV, and the RNC stands for the resource and competencies of an organization. So it is something that an organization is normally able to describe for himself. The second, the O stand for organization. It means what are my possibilities in terms of constructing an organization that realize the promise of value that he claims, it claims, sorry. And this is both internal to the organization as well as external to the organization, and I will come back later in how to do that. And this ends into a value proposition and a value architecture, but it stands for the V, the value, and we will talk in detail about those two terms later. So, why it is important for biocontrol? Because biocontrol, there are research on biocontrol for a long period of time, and unfortunately, as Thibaut underlined, the growth of the sector is way below its potential. It was already true like 10 or 15 years ago, but now with the recent IPCC and IPBES report, it has been noticed that agroecology is a way to reduce the impact of agriculture and of farming. Okay, so it's written in those elements. So why doesn't work, even if from a societal point of view, it is important, seen as important to develop agroecology and hence biocontrol, because biocontrol is part of it. So there is a lack of financial resources to develop those companies. It's more difficult to find, to raise funds for biotech, farming biotech than for health biotech, for example. There is also the question that there is entry barriers reinforcement. So I took back the presentation on Thibaut, but we can also talk about entry barriers related to regulation. So the registration process that the microorganisms are submitted to. So there is this, and also the weight of the agro-industry and the weight of chemical entrants in terms of major actors. Just for an idea, the concentration rate of pesticide industry is 7. It means that the 7 biggest companies are making is 80%. It means the 7 biggest company makes 80% of the all industry in terms of revenue. Okay, so it's very hard to fight when you have this kind of structure, and it creates entry barriers. So there are many different entry barriers in the field, and also the question that for the moment only one type of biocontrol, the products, are valued in the society, whereas there are many different kinds of biocontrol. Okay, and also I would say that there are products and also techniques. But we tend to value and to marketize those products the same way chemical products are. Right, so biocontrol is stuck into conventional views. There are the regulatory constraints that create an artificial difference since 2000. It was in 1996, and it was the imposition of the regulation was in 2006. It's only for microorganisms, for pheromones, etc. And you can see that in particular, it was applied to the kind of biocontrol that could be formalized more or less the same way than chemical products. So there is it was much more the form than the very, how to say that, than the characteristics, the properties of biocontrol that are valued into these forms. And also the fact that we expect the same results from those products than conventional pesticide, even if it's not said. So we ignore the balance effect of biocontrol techniques, I would say, and we expect an eradication. And it's always come back in the fields when we are going to make interviews with my colleague Manuel. It always come back that people say, okay, but it's not efficient. Yeah, it's not efficient because they compare that to chemical. So, and there is always this idea that it should be as efficient as chemicals are. So it questions the value proposition of biocontrol. So what is the very proposition that is made by biocontrol? What is the claim that biocontrol should present and how to achieve it? So I will try to contribute to that quickly. So just to come back, there are those three elements. So value proposition, value network, and value architecture as our two interesting components that we will develop now. Organizational resource, I won't deal with that now. Because it's very related to each organization. Okay, I cannot choose for you or for the people the resources and competence that they have. All those things are relating together. So there is it should be a circle, but I didn't have place. And generally, so we will dig deeper into value proposition and value network. I like better the term value architecture because there is the idea that we can construct something, that we can build something new. Value network with the idea that there is a network and I will just take advantage of these existing networks. So in this context, profit should be seen as a consequence. So I already talked to you about that. So the value proposition concerns the customer, but not only. It also concerns other people in the value chain. And generally, when we think about something, we always think about who is the last person that will use that. For example, in biocontrol, it is very complicated to transport some of biocontrol from one point to another. But all the logistics is not taken into consideration. And it's more easy, for example, for cooperative to store chemical products than biocontrol products. So it's also a question into the supply chain that needs to be adapted, all right? Then your proposition has to be relevant, pertinent, and also attractive. So it's easy to say that. It's like, okay, attractiveness, pertinence. So how can we think about that in the value proposition? First, it's about concept. What is your concept? What do you propose, okay? And second, so I'm going fast because I still have things to say. It's about the use. So what are the use of the people at the different moments of the life cycle of the products or techniques or service, all right? So this is a value proposition. It's actually a reflection of what the product or the service or the techniques can do and how I can show that it's attractive, it's interesting, it fits with practices. What would be the concepts that make the biocontrol efficient and usable? But the value proposition also depends on the organization level. So it means that we have to think about that in the wider context of the let's say, the organization or the entrepreneurial context. It means that if you already have products, you have to think it in relation to the other products. If you don't have it's new products, you have to think it in relation with the competitors' products. Okay, so it's always what am I developing? Okay. Is it for the first time? What is the competitive context? What are the rules, the habits, the key success factors of the domain? And am I supposed to change those key success factors or to just change a minor aspect of that? Then there is also the sector industry, and we already talked about that. It's a particular domain here because it's already big companies and big value chains that are creating a domain that are creating some kind of a rigidity of the domain, and it is very difficult to think about that without thinking about the way it is done today. So it's difficult to step back from what we know of the protection of the culture. Anyways, how to use it? So the value proposition, I told you that it's about attractiveness. Okay. So attractiveness, we can think about that as the idea of a benefit-risk balance, but it's not the same that in toxicology, for example, because it's based on perception of people, okay? It's very much the social benefit-risk balance. So the attractiveness of the value proposition results from a trade-off made by customers, by users at the different level of the value chain, and I come later on this term. And for example, I give you some example of perceived benefits. It can be the relative advantage to use the product or the service. Maybe it can improve the comfort. It can be because it saves time, it saves money, it's a better organization, there is a regulatory compliance, it helps developing other products, etc., etc. So it creates a relative advantage to what is already existing. If it's a new product, people won't compare because it's new. When, for example, Apple created the iPhone, we couldn't compare with something else. It was just new, it was different. But if a product already exists, you will necessarily compare with the benefits you get from the existing products, all right? So a second point that you can, for example, have in mind is the transparency of use, meaning the easiness of use of the product. It means that it's clearly expressed, people can understand what you say. There are services that help you take into consideration the use of the product. You can, for example, provide a tool to deliver the product. You can provide knowledge about the product. You can provide, I don't know, a digital application to help using the product or the service, etc., etc. So how you make the use of your innovation more easy, more transparent for the different users. And also, another point that can be the compatibility. So generally, when you do your work, and it's the case for farmers or for agro-industrials, there is this idea that you always have different practices and materials. So is your product easy to use with what you already invested into? So you have to think about what do people use. For example, let's take an example. A cooperative do not use biocontrol. It is for the farmers. But a cooperative has to keep it during some times to make it available to farmers. So how to make a cooperative have the possibility to supply, so to make the link between the producers and the farmers. So it's not only about the final users, the farming, okay? And you can find other examples, but it's generally with the main benefits that we can think about. That there are many. It's not an end list, you know, so we can develop that. On m'a dit 30, je suis à 20. Yeah, 25, I know. Je suis d'accord. So also you have to make a choice. The cost of making a choice. So for example, you have a telephone, you know that it works. If you want to change telephone, maybe it won't be as good as the other, you know, these kind of things. It's a risk. So you have to balance the risk. And also the cost of transferring from one techniques to another, Okay, you have to change many things around. So I have to speed up. I'll give my presentation and you read the... So if it's a low perceived sacrifice, low perceived benefits, it's not very interesting. So what we like all the time is the crush things, so strong determination, or the value max. More risk for crush than for value max. So the value architecture is the means to realize the value proposition. Value architecture, so let's keep architecture, not value network. So it implies to think about internally in relation to your own value chain, externally to the global value chain, and the partnership and the relation to stakeholders that you can have. But the stakeholders, for example, in a very wide way. So I won't develop more now. If you have questions after, and I'll answer. But first of all, so the question about the internal value chain is, what do we do? How do we do that? And if it's a project, say, what would we like to do? And what is the best way to do it? And what are our possibilities to do what we want to do? After, you always have to make choices, but this question is very important. And in relation to the internal activity, it is you definitely have to explicit your value chain or your ideal in terms of the value chain. So what is done internally? What do I want to do? Where am I the best at, for example? What are the processes that I do manage? What are those that I'm very bad at? What is the kind of organization I want to develop? What is the practice that I can help? Do I have structure? Do I have the techniques? Do I already have the markets, etc., etc.? Then, what is outsourced? Which kind of suppliers, which kind of partners do I need to develop my own value chain? And this, you have to think about that at a different level. So, to supply my things, to distribute, to make the research, to make it available for customers, etc., etc. Then you have to think about the global value chain. So, in particular, it's very important in agro-industry. And here the question are to identify the actors that are actually impacted by biocontrol characteristics. So what I was talking to you just before about the cooperative. So who are directly impacted, how they are impacted, what does it make on their own business, what would help them to contribute to yours, and to what extent this impact is, you can overcome it or it's difficult to do it. Then what would minor this impact, propose artifacts, knowledge, etc. Who can change the practices of the global value chains? Discourses, politics, etc., etc., and how to distribute it and store it, for example. What are the practices of distribution and storage? So when you think in relation to this value chain, you have a good chance to identify all the lock-ins that you might meet at a point or another. So in this workshop, the idea is to elaborate a co-working to identify the actual different kind of business model that were put into practice. Even at a small scale, we don't care because it gives ideas. So there is this idea of trying to see whether or not there is hallmarks for the different biocontrols, or if there is a hallmarks for all the biocontrols, etc., and to foster creativity to further develop a business model for biocontrol and change the structure of the industry.
Thank you very much, Aura. And thank you for respecting the time.
It's not what I do generally.
I'm impressed. Do you have questions for Aura? I'm checking in the chat. Well, maybe I have one. Not a very complicated one, but maybe difficult to answer anyway. It's about examples. Do you have examples of events, initiatives, policies that triggered a change of business models?
In biocontrol or
in the field of agriculture, if possible, or others?
I would say that there are some examples. I know some of them. Some of them will be presented tomorrow. I won't talk about them. But for example, the example Saveol, who developed the production of insects for themselves, is actually a business model because they didn't find, or Fresnat, who is developing the same models. So it's, and Fresnat is working with Saveol to import a model and to adapt it because they couldn't find insect that would correspond to strawberry culture. So they had to develop research and development to create the adapted to find a good insect that works in-house, etc., etc. So Saveol did this one for them. Fresnat is developing apparently this based on the counseling of Saveol. It can be seen as a business model that is different. So they are not depending anymore on the usual supply chain, and they are not suffering for the lack of insects, for example. Yes, Simon.
Thank you. Just to add that in the case of Fresnat, the research on which is based the technology was funded by the stakeholders, by the strawberry producer union. Yeah. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why it works so well, to get the stakeholders involved in the research itself.
Yeah, and I think that Manuel might talk about that later, but someone already talks about the research, and that's true that it was already used.
Yeah, I just wanted to complement what Simon said in the end, because Thibaut was saying that we are mostly researchers, but there are also lots of companies in the audience, and that's really important because researcher work stops very often before reaching that point of reflection about business models. And actually, I mean, as a researcher transitioning into creating a company, there's a big shift, and there's it's a whole new thing. So the really important point is how to create stronger collaboration partnership between companies that also open a bit more their mind and think, okay, there's something here that could be interesting to put on the market, and I will collaborate with research. But I feel like from what I've experienced so far in the last years, that there's still a gap between those two. Well, and hopefully that's the goal of the workshop, to solve that gap.
Yeah, you're right. I think that there is still a huge gap, and there is, but Manuel can. It's a gap on the development, actually, because there is the research that is done by labs, and generally a company is made to make money. We want to, and developing things for a company, it's a huge investment, and you cannot provide research with 4% of your revenue, for example. It's a very high level. Only a big company can do that, which explains also why those big companies can do that. And small ones, it's difficult.
Last question.
Thank you. I have a question regarding the value proposition. Mm-hmm. So you say that you can propose in the framework of organization and sector industry. I'm wondering if we can add another level, which is the regulation level, and if proposal can be also to modify regulation.
I think it's part of a business proposition, but it's the lobbying action. When I did my PhD in a biocontrol company, my topic were initially lobby, because they were thinking that if we want to get registration, we want to have registration number, we need to lobby European Commission. And after 6 months I worked, and I said, no, you need first competence. So I did my works on organizational competence on registration. But when you're a bigger company, or when there is a syndicate that can defend people, it's also the work. It is part of value, not the value proposition, but the value architecture, to think about political engagement. And there is a problem that because at the research level, it's very not seen as positive to lobby. It's not the work of researcher, for example. But companies don't have so much time, particularly small companies do not have time and resources to do this. Like, I don't know if you know that, but a huge company can have until like 30 people working at the European Commission. You cannot have 30 people working there all the time.
Okay, very last question, which is a comment.
Okay, thank you. Just because we are in the introduction of the workshop, I was wondering the definition and the business model, the who, for who we want a business model. Is it for company, private company? Is it for the grower? Is it because we talk about biocontrol, but other things around? And I know, at least for me, for who, if it can be clarified or precise.
I don't know if I understood your question, but the business model is very much like it can be seen as a heuristic for the company, and you can explore different perspective lobbying. You don't have to reveal that to everyone. And I think that what you talk about is business plan. So in a business plan, you can make a business plan different for your bank, for investors, for regulators. So when you present some things, after you present only one part of your business models, and a business plan is generally, you will redo as many business plans as you need to convince people. It's another artifact, but the business model is very much something that belongs to the society. It doesn't have to be presented in all its dimensions, okay? There are something, for example, I'll give you an example. Let's say that you work with an incubator. Okay, the incubator tells you that you have to develop this kind of product because it's more valuable for them. But you have the idea, for example, to make a service. So you don't have to say to the incubator that you still intend to make the service. So you keep it secret until, but if you find, let's say, a customer for your service, I can assure you that the incubator won't be sad and won't, you know. So a business model is very much a heuristic to help you change, and you can change your business model all the time. It evolves as long as you evolve and you change things, you have more resources, you can change your business model. It's very much something that you can use in a creative manner, and you can also present that. Sorry.
Well, I'm sorry to cut this interesting discussion. Maybe just to clarify that point, maybe if it's about the target, the audience, and for whom are we making this workshop, and for whom are we discussing about business models? I think it's even a take-home message. It's not only for companies. The key idea is that, well, almost any actor in the value chain could be an innovator, a leader of biocontrol. For example, from today until tomorrow, you will probably see different types of actors that took the lead and created their own innovation in biocontrol. Farmers, a group, etc. So it's not only about creating a company or for companies, even if companies can also change of business model, adapt, and so it's for all stakeholders actually.
I'm sorry, but just to it's in your line, totally. Just that concerning the biocontrol industry, we are in a fluid moment. So it's not, it is all changing all the time, you know? And it seems to be very structured because there is an industry behind, but it's actually changing, the society is changing at the same time. So it's a particular moment for the industry. I think that we should all take that into consideration. take advantage. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Aura. And remember that you also get the pause within a few minutes to discuss with Aura.